Welcome back to More Than Just a Canine podcast, real stories from the working dog and canine world. I'm your host, Dustin Stiles. I'm glad you are here. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you enjoy. On today's episode, we are sitting down with someone who has spent over 2 decades at the highest levels of canine detection, military service, global deployments, and helping shape some of the most advanced detection dog programs in the world. From explosive detection to cutting-edge research and even conservation work, this conversation is going to challenge the way you think about dogs and what they're truly capable of. Whether you're a handler, a trainer, or just passionate about working dogs, this episode is full of valuable insight. So let's get into it. So, Mr. Paul Bunker, welcome to the show.
Hey, Dustin, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
You are more than welcome. All right, so question number 1. So let's start at the beginning. What first drew you to working with dogs, and how did that eventually lead into your military career?
So, over 4 decades, I've been involved in professionally training canines, but it started way before that. I mean, one of the first photographs I have of myself is with a dog in a kennel, is my dad's dog, a border collie. And all my life, I've been brought up around dogs, working dogs, predominantly border collies, but in my later early teens, it was border collies, Labradors, and pointers as hunting dogs and working dogs. And at that time, I would go and spend time with my father on a farm out in the country, and there was no other kids about during the summer holidays and weekends. So I'd spend my time walking around the fields with the dogs because he'd be off working somewhere. And, just spend most of my youth with dogs, and kind of just, fell into that field that dogs were always going to be part of my life, but decided I wanted to make it into a profession. So I left school at 15, hated school. I wanted to join the police to be a police dog handler, but in those days you had to be 5'10", I think it is, and I was 5'7 3/4. So I couldn't make it in the police, although I applied and did the interviews and everything. They said, you're too short. So the only other option back then to be in canine was with the military. So I went to the army recruitment, and at that time you had to be 18 to actually join the adult service, as it was called. So on my 18th birthday, I signed up and I joined the Royal Army Veterinary Corps to be a dog trainer.
When you were serving as a canine trainer in the British Army's Royal Army Veterinary Corps, what did that actually look like day to day?
It depended on what deployment you was on. My full-time role was dog trainer. That's all we did. But we do instructing, training handlers, assessing canines, the full gamut all the way through. So in the early days, that was patrol dogs, bite dogs. Started off, did a full 6-month infantry training because you had to be an infantry soldier first. After basic training, then I joined the unit of the Royal Army Veterinary Corps, did a 2-week basic dog handlers course, then a 3-month equitation course learning to ride a horse, then 1 month veterinary hospital to learn basic veterinary technician work, and then a 3-month dog trainers course. And that course was patrol dogs, bite dogs. You got 3 dogs to train. One was half trained, one was totally green, and one had a problem that had been progressing through training with another trainer and then was found to have a problem. You had to train all 3 within 3 months, as well as obviously learn all the ins and outs of canine welfare, standards of training, deployments, military deployments. You'd go on exercises and those sort of things. So it took a year to actually become a dog trainer and fully become part of the Royal Army Veterinary Corps. After that, most of my work was day-to-day training patrol dogs, bite dogs, because that's where you start your apprenticeship. I then deployed to, or was posted to Germany, and ended up there for 4 years. And it was during that time that I started handling arms explosive search dogs, which is basically explosive detection dogs, but we also looked for armaments. So it'd be weapons, weapon parts, ammunition, that sort of thing as well with the same canine. And then it was during my time there that I actually progressed through our training standards. So we did a B3, which is your basic course. dog trainer's course, B2, which is like your intermediate dog trainer's course, and then a B1. B1's the specialist dog trainer advanced course. I did that while I was in Germany, and I trained my first detection dog while I was out there. And from then on, I just did detection. I loved detection, and I stuck with it really for the rest of my career, either as a handler, as a trainer, as an instructor, or as an assessor, actually bringing canines into the military. So, just like any other military, you could deploy at any point. I deployed to different countries and got posted to different countries. Basically, I was always involved in detection from kind of that period, which would have been in the very late is when I finished my patrol work.
What was your first experience training a detection dog like, and how has that approach evolved since then?
So the first dog I did train was a German Shepherd, a little pocket German Shepherd called Yalta. That was in Germany as part of my Class 1 exam, B1 exam. And back then, we would take the explosives, we would place them in a tube, either a metal or plastic tube that had holes in it and was sealed at the ends. And then we'd throw them down the street. And the dog would run, pick them up, bring them back to us. And then we would, after a period of time of getting the dog engaged in the game with the explosives, we would actually then hide the explosive in, under some logs or something, let the dog go and dig for it and drag it out and bring it back to us. And then we'd play retrieve with it. And we built up the whole process based on that system. And back then, when you deployed, there was no passive response, it was all active. So when you deployed, the idea was that you read your dog's changing behavior, and on a changing behavior, you cued the dog a leave command and then got the dog back to you and then told EOD or whoever engineers that you're working with, that's where you need to check. So very different from nowadays with the passive response and um, using toys or food, etc., and clickers and stuff. Um, I'm still glad that I went through that training back then because it makes me understand so much more now how better dog training is and our understanding of dog training nowadays. And you know, imagine looking for IEDs with a dog that digs at it. You wouldn't even think about that nowadays, but that's the way we did it. But it also meant, I learned canine body language so well. Reading that change of behavior was critical. I mean, it was life-saving skill. And still today, I read dogs' behavior really well, um, and try and teach people the importance of being able to read your dog's body language. But it was something that was just we had to do it back then, so we learned it.
What makes detection dogs so uniquely effective compared to technology?
Well, they're a multimodal platform. So they're a biosensor, obviously. They can move into just about any environment. Obviously, I do a lot of off leash. In fact, it's all off leash unless there's a safety concern. All my work is off leash. So we can go into just about any environment with the dogs. They can work at distance. We can imprint literally in one day a brand new target if we need to. Dogs can make decisions based on the information that's placed in front of them, based on the training we've given them. So they can discriminate, they can generalize, they can solve problems on their own. They have the confidence to actually do these sort of things. And technology just isn't at that point yet, where as long as the training is effective, we've developed a biosensory platform that can go into these locations and actually make decisions and decide, is this target or not? Do I dismiss this or not? How do I encounter this obstacle or what's placed in front of me? And we're there to support our dogs, but ultimately we've developed a technology, and dogs are a technology that actually think, which is something, even AI nowadays, I use AI sometimes and you have to reread it because some of the stuff it tells you is just not right. So at least with the dogs, as long as the training's invested into them, they're a lot more flexible and a lot more sensitive than technology.
You helped develop explosive detection dog programs. What were some of the biggest challenges in building those programs?
Convincing the people that weren't involved in the programs, people that were involved in the programs, they were invested, and they saw the value. And even people that joined the program that had no experience or prior experience in a different field, once they saw the dog's work and the capability, they were sold. But people outside the program, that is the hardest part, trying to sell how good the dogs can be.
Yep, I understand that. What makes a dog specifically suited for explosive detection?
I think again we go back to that flexibility. The dog is so flexible in everything it does, and our ability to actually train the dogs and shape those dogs to be effective support in our missions that they're something that can't be parallel, can't be matched. Nothing is parallel to a dog, and because they don't have to see with our own eyes what we're looking for, it's all done on odor detection. Then
Mhm.
again, that's something that we as humans limited. We have a Mark 1 eyeball, which is incredible, but that's no good in a concealed device. So the dogs supported by the human are the best technology out there, and I don't think anything will ever match that, or not for a long time.
What did operational deployment actually look like in places like the Balkans?
So in the Balkans, I served several tours of the Balkans. I was there 2 years in total, either in Kosovo or Bosnia, and it varied on my role there. So most of the time in Bosnia, I was the platoon sergeant, so I was in charge of the dog section, running the dog section, make sure when the canines deployed, the handlers were all doing their job and supported, etc. However, in Kosovo, I was doing that role, plus I was an explosive detection dog handler, so I'd go out on jobs as well. And then for part of my time in the Balkans, I was actually deployed with UXO landmine detection dogs. So we spent a lot of time in the community, away from military bases, actually integrated with humanitarian demining, but we supported the military demining. And I was training military teams to actually support military operations. So I was training as well as instructing, as well as handling, as well as managing. It varied in those 2 years. And I got to travel all over Bosnia more than anything. So I had a great time. I had operational finds, I was training, I was deploying, I was doing everything that I love to do as a dog person.
You received the NATO Joint Commanders Commendation, which, I mean, that says in words, is amazing award that you got. What did that recognition mean to you personally?
Obviously, it's nice to be recognized, but more importantly, it was the engineers that actually recognized me. It wasn't my own unit. It wasn't the Royal Army Veterinary Corps, my own unit. It was the end user that was receiving these canine teams actually on the ground doing operations. And they're the ones that recognized me because I developed the landmine detection program, canine detection program from zero up and actually deployed with it to the Balkans. And those teams deployed into the Balkans. So it was recognition of kind of the development of that whole program, but also the deployment. And obviously, those guys were the ones going out and doing the work. But it meant a lot because it came from the end user, the people that actually trusted those dogs to do the job in front of them, which was looking for landmines in this case, a very high risk job. And they actually recognized how the canines were valuable to them in that role.
Wow, that's good stuff. How do you prepare both the dog and the handler to perform under extreme stress and uncertainty?
So the dog, you invest time in building confidence, which I talk about a lot when I do my workshops and mentoring, etc. We build the confidence in the dogs. We give them the tools to actually do their job, make decisions, solve problems, those sort of things. And we invest time in their training to make sure they clearly understand all aspects that they would be involved with, including odor recognition, generalization, discrimination, everything. So you can invest all that in time in training protocols. With a human, that's a slightly different approach because you have to not only train them to be a handler, which is a job in itself, but also critical thinking and how to get out there and actually be in high risk situations, which obviously an explosive detection dog team deployed on some of these deployments, Iraq, Afghanistan, the Balkans, and other conflicts. People are out there trying to kill them, and they've got a dog that's there to save them and their team's lives and civilians and everyone else. So actually building that understanding, that confidence and critical thinking is important. And it goes back to when I was saying about reading body language and understanding what the dog is telling you. In my time in Kosovo, I had operational fines, and not once did my dog, who was an amazing dog, a yellow Labrador called Thistle, who had a phenomenal passive response, sit response. Not once in real life did he ever give me a trained final response. It was all changing behavior. And I reported changing behavior and said, hey, I'm not happy with this. You need to check this location out. And every time something was found when I did do that. And that's critical thinking, it's being on the ground and actually feeling those hairs on the back of your neck start to tingle and say, something's not right. My dog's acting weird. It's showing me something different. I need to do something about this. And so trying to train that sort of thing into people can be difficult. Recently, we supported the Legacy US War Dog Association Legacy Week on Lackland. 25 teams were military teams were invited, and we put them through. I put them through scenarios like that, like search awareness and reading your dog and high hides and bulk hides and everything I could that made them actually challenge the handler to actually be at one with their dog, kind of, feel the force. But you have to be at that point where you're an integrated team and you actually understand that dog so much that you're reading everything it is telling you.
Yep. And know how important that is. You were later brought in by the United States Department of Defense to help establish the specialized search dog program. How did that opportunity come about?
My last 2 years of service in the British Army were training American engineers in landmine detection with their canine program. And concurrently to that, some of the engineers went on the arms explosive search dog, which is equivalent of or very similar to the specialized search dog program that the US adopted. So when I came up to retirement, I was approached and asked, well, would you come to the United States and actually train people stateside instead of us sending all our students over to the UK for 3 months to do the handler course? So I did. It was a pilot program in Missouri. We was in a trailer on a car park at the back of the MP school. Um, the initial course was 4 students, and then I think we went to 12 students and 12 students. So we did 3 courses, and at completion of that, the DoD decided to adopt the program and move it down to Lackland. So that's how I kind of started to get involved. And when it moved to Lackland, I moved back to the UK. It was a 1 year contract. And then after about 6 weeks of being back, it was Christmas. Someone called me and said, well, would you come back and help advise Lackland the integration of this program? So just for 6 weeks, said, yeah, I would. And I went back, and that was 21 years ago.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
it just got extended. Then I brought some more Brits over, and we ended up staying on the SSD program for about 6 years, I think it was.
What made that program different from more traditional detection dog programs?
It was off leash. I mean, that was the main crux of it. As is nowadays, people working the dogs either on a 6 foot or a 360. With the off leash program, we were out at 100 meters or whatever it was, standoff distance. And you're out looking for IEDs, which are there to kill you, or kill your team. That's why they were
Mhm.
deployed. And as much as we never want to lose a dog, at the end of the day, if that dog could protect a platoon or section or just one man or civilians, that's something that can't be replaced.
Right.
So it was the standoff detection capability that made it very different. I mean, there was other things, but homemade explosives were part of the program. We did add munitions into it, UXO, etc. But it's the standoff capability that made it stand out, I think.
Okay. At what point did you decide to start your own company?
So it was in 2017. I was promoted from after being the program manager for Office Naval Research IDD 2.0. I was promoted to director of the canine school at K2 Solutions. Um,
Wow.
and honestly, I did not enjoy that position. I was away from dogs. I was dealing with people, and I'm not the most people of people. It's not something I enjoy particularly. And it happened that I met someone, a Brit. at a conference in San Antonio in Texas looking at oil spills. And he discussed with me about how can dogs find oil spills, and I explained how it was so similar to landmine detection. I mean, basically you're looking for a substance under the ground that's naturalized into the environment. So the principles are the same. Obviously the end result is slightly different, but the principles are the same. um, and we did a little research trial. He got some funding to do some research to see if dogs could detect oil at 3 foot, which they did. And based on that, there was an oil spill up in Canada. And we deployed a couple of dogs. I was still director at this point. I went up there for a little technical advisor, made sure the team's deployed, but I came back and carried on my director role. And then the next year, the Canadians wanted 4 teams to go up for an extended period because the spill was a lot bigger than they thought. And I went up there with one of the canines. Basically, I said to the owner of the company, look, I won this work. I want to be involved. And I went up there, I took a canine myself, plus 3 handlers with canines. And I spent 4 months, 6 days a week out on the river searching with my dog. I had over 3,500 confirmed finds with my canine. The teams had 10,000 altogether. There was moose and there was bear and there was beaver, and I was working with scientists cleaning up the environment. We worked with
Wow.
First Nation, indigenous tribe people, and I loved it. And I came back, and within 4 weeks, I'd left the company and said, I'm done. And I decided to start my own company.
Okay, yeah, there you go. I bet that was a fun experience for
Yeah.
sure. So, what inspired well, you kinda talked about it a little bit, but what inspired the Chiron canine? What does that name and I'm saying it right, hopefully, Chiron represent?
It's Chiron. In English, it's Chiron. Normally in American, I think you say Chiron, but in English we pronounce it Chiron. I think actually the real pronunciation is Chiron. So Chiron was a Greek mythology. He was a centaur, and typical centaurs were partiers, they were drinkers, they would fight, they were raucous crowd. But Chiron's mother was a human. So he was half human. So unlike other centaurs, he is half human. And he was a mentor, he was an educator, he developed some of the sciences, medicine, those sort of things. Well, in the Royal Army Veterinary Corps, the cap badge is Chiron. We have the Corps has a quarterly magazine called Chiron Calling, which is all about the Corps news. So when I left, I decided I wanted to start my company, go back under the same badge, if you like, and hence it's Chiron. But also, Chiron's a mentor. He invents things, he develops things, and that's basically the way that my company was molded, and it's what I do. So Chiron was very fitting.
I like that, I really like that. How is Chiron Canine different from other canine training organizations?
So it's a very small show, if you want to call it that. It's myself. I do have a training partner that joined me about 2 years ago just because I was getting more and more projects. The whole focus of Chiron Canine is detection. And it started off with environmental and conservation work because I enjoy environment and conservation work. They're a challenge for me, to train dogs that have into programs that have never been trained before, and I've trained dogs to do things that have never been done before ever in the world. So that's good for me as a dog trainer to have these challenges and develop different technologies to help train dogs or develop the dogs into new odors that have never been done before and deploy them. But by happenstance, I read a paper by someone called Dr. Nathan Hall of Texas Tech University's Canine Olfaction Research and Education Lab. And it's about 6 hours from here up in Lubbock. So I asked him if I could visit. He said, yeah, we went up there. And he's based in, I believe it's an old abattoir. And in the back room of his lab was some large freezer rooms where they would keep the beasts, when they'd slaughtered them. It's not obviously not an abattoir anymore. And when I saw that, I'd had this idea about, well, I had a hypothesis that canines, if you take them from a hot environment into a cold environment or vice versa, it affects their olfaction capability. And I had a
Wow.
couple of experiences why I believe this happened. And I discussed it with him and I said, look, you've got these big walk in freezers. Would you be prepared to partner with me if I submit a proposal for some research? And he agreed. So I did. The agency I submitted to said, yeah, we're interested in that. And they funded a research project. And they converted two of those fridges into climate controlled actual work chambers. So the humidity could be monitored and changed as well as the temperature. And then I trained 8 dogs for that project. We sent them up there, they completed the project, and it was true. They found that dogs, when you take them from, they kept them in a standard environment, which is like 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 40% humidity. And then they would go into the chamber at different climatic conditions. So there would be hot, dry, hot, humid, very hot, humid, and then cold, dry, cold, humid. And there was a decrement in detection capability going into, obviously, as you would expect, the hot, dry, and the hot, humid, and then the extreme heat. But they also saw changes the other way round. But more importantly, what was recognized was that when you take a dog from standard environment, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 40% humidity, into 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 40% humidity, there's still this decrement in detection capability. And we called it the startup effect. And it takes up to 3 minutes in extreme conditions for your dog's olfaction capability to actually kick in and be fully operational. But even for going from standard temperature into standard temperature, there's still a warm up period that your dog's olfaction needs to encounter. So that was kind of the first integration into research. And then from then on, I've done lots of research. So about 40% of the company time now is research. 50% would be actually in the field doing stuff because I still love to handle and be out in the field doing dogs. And about 10%, I do workshops, seminars, and certifications. So that's kind of how it's shaped. And I think there's not many companies out there actually doing that. I don't do any services other than, if there's been an oil spill, I'll go out with my dog, but I don't employ handlers or have a lot of handlers on staff or anything actually doing work. We just do research and training predominantly, and then I go out and handle because I love it.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting. That's something that I didn't even know when it comes to the weather, the humidity, and things that could affect the dogs. That's some very interesting stuff. Which actually, the next couple questions is on the sciences. So let's see. For someone hearing this for the first time, the dog's sense of smell. How does it actually work, and what makes it so powerful?
If it was only that easy to answer, because it's clear that, we as humans don't fully understand yet the capability of
Oh,
canines. And the research is expanding all the time and just showing more and more how good dogs are. That goes back to 40 years ago when I started, compared to now. The comparison is not even black and white, it's even broader than that. And the things we're achieving nowadays with canines, we couldn't fathom 40 years ago, cancer detection and all the conservation work we do, and diabetes detection and seizure
right.
detection and all these sort of things that you would not think is even possible. How the dogs do it, we can theorize the lock and key method, the vibration method. I believe the lock and key method, where there's receptors inside the canine's nose, which are designed to fit the certain shape of molecules, and they fit together and unlock the lock and produce a response in the dog, which is associated with a reinforcer. We do know that they can certainly detect parts per billion and lower. There's no problem in us understanding it's lower. I've seen
Yeah.
it myself with some of my dogs versus technology, that they've detected target from 30 meters away and gone into source. And we've held technology that, and it's published work, we've held technology that is calibrated to 1 part per million, and it can even detect the target 1 inch from the source when it was buried, whereas the dog detected it from 30 meters away.
Right.
So, again, I don't think we're even touching the iceberg to actually understand the capability of canine olfaction. Not fully, not yet. So we're just scratching the surface of
Eh,
understanding. So I'd love to be
Okay.
able to answer, but I don't think anyone knows at the minute.
Right. Well, hopefully one day we will, because like you said, we've come a long way from 40 years ago. So get backing off that a little bit. How do you scientifically measure or evaluate a dog's detection accuracy?
So the way we do it is we have something called an olfactometer. This is a device that was built by Dr. Nathan Hall of the Texas Tech University. He has a lot more advanced versions than I have. I have one in my lab. And basically, with that, particularly with his version specifically, it's an electronic based valve system. And it uses a staircase approach. And I'll describe that as when you go for a hearing test. And I'm sure a lot of people on the podcast will have done that. And you put the earphones on and they tell you, press the button when you hear a buzz. And you press the button. And if you don't press the button, so it goes down 2 steps when you hear something, and if you don't press the button, it goes up 1 step, and then it bounces down 2 steps and goes up a step, and it keeps bouncing around to evaluate the threshold of your hearing. Well, we do the same, or, that's the way it's done with dogs to understand their threshold. So you take the odor down and down and down till the point they stop responding on the target, and then you bounce it up 1, and then you go down 2, and you bounce up 1, and you go down 2, and you bounce around till you find that mean level of their threshold. And that's how you actually can test their threshold on certain substances. Now, on the understanding that different substances, dogs have different threshold levels, but also different dogs have different threshold levels. That first project I spoke about, I sent 8 dogs up, 4 Labradors and 4 pointers, all working dogs, all from a working dog background. 7 of the dogs would detect the target odor at parts per million. One of the dogs, a pointer, he was detecting at parts per billion. And yet they were all working dogs. 4 of them were pointers, and one of the pointers was way more sensitive to that specific target than any of the other dogs. So, it's individualist to the dogs as well as the target, as well as the environment. They all have influences. The investment of training in that dog, they all have influences on that capability. So again, it's not something that can be just given a number because it fluctuates so much.
Okay, that's actually interesting. Actually brings me to a question I was just thinking to myself is so is that used for different species to say, well, this dog can smell better than this species, kind of like a everybody knows about the bloodhound is one of the best dogs to smell. Is that process used to say, this one is I say better, but can smell better than this one?
It has to some degree. I know that Dr. Hall did do some comparative research. And actually, if I'm remembering correctly of that research, a Frenchie outperformed, I think it was a Malinois. It was certainly a working detection dog. The Frenchie had more sensitive olfactory capability. The problem is, who would want to deploy with a Frenchie? A poodle could have better detection capability, but you're not necessarily going to deploy with the poodle. So it's the whole picture. What dog are you able to deploy with in an operational environment, work off leash, has the energy, duration, and desire to work all day and still find its target? Well, that's not going to be a Frenchie. Even if it has the best nose, the whole holistic approach to that dog does not suit what you're trying to find. So, again, it's not an easy answer to say one or the other. You have to look at the whole approach.
Right. Well, I'd say that throw the enemy off. You deploy with the poodle, it would definitely throw them off. They would probably know what to think of that one.
Mm.
How important is evidence based training in the field?
I think for me, it's very important when I've done integrations where we've taken a concept, deployed it into the lab or investigated it in the lab, and then deployed those results into the field and improved the capability of the whole program. To me, it's very important. Now, having the understanding that not all lab-based research can transfer into real life. That's not the aim of it. It's to give you answers, and the purpose of us being dog trainers is to actually interpret that information and apply that into the real world, because the real world is very different from the lab, obviously. But we've done that very effectively in some of our projects where we've taken the lab-based information. And actually, I've just submitted a paper about one of these projects that I really didn't think it would work as well as it did, but the lab showed how sensitive the dogs are and how we could calibrate them in a certain way, that we actually then trained those dogs into the field and deployed with them, and they were 100% in the field. They nailed it. And that just demonstrated how I was challenged with my belief of how sensitive the dogs were. But the lab based research actually demonstrated the capability. And then I took that information and applied it to real dogs and deployed with them. So to me, I think the evidence to support some of this is very important. Now, it doesn't have to be in a university lab or something. I do a lot of research myself with my dogs. We can set up research at home and actually ask questions and get answers. That is research. You might not be doing it in a fancy lab or with fancy equipment, but you can certainly do it yourselves if you give the dogs the tools they need to be able to do that job and you have the understanding of how to apply that. So it's all evidence, it's just different levels of evidence based on what you require.
Understood. What are some of the biggest mistakes or misconceptions even experienced trainers make?
Yeah. So, first of all, I'm going to say not training the dog in front of them. So, some trainers will fall into the trap of having a way of training, and that's the way I train dogs. And that's not suitable for all dogs. You must be flexible to actually adapt your training techniques based on the dog and what the dog is telling you and what you need that dog to do. But the other thing is be open. Don't be closed minded. And even if you see something and think, no, I'm never going to use that technique or I could never use that protocol, that's fine. At least you've given it an opportunity, you've analyzed it, maybe you've given it a go yourself and said, no, that just doesn't fit my methodology. That doesn't fit me as a person and the way I believe we should train dogs. So I think some of the challenges are that not being open and just having this mindset this is how you train a dog and this is how I'm going to do it. And it doesn't work for all dogs. So the bigger challenge is more the human brain and the ability to adapt based on what's required and what's placed in front of you.
A big part of your work, and that you spoke of already, is research and development. So, what kind of experiments are you currently running, and what does that environment look like?
So right now we're just doing some conservation dog training. We're prepping up for a research project as part of DHS, which I can't talk too much about at this stage, but it's going to be looking at producing a training aid to support a particular issue that's been encountered on transportation. So whether that's aircraft or cargo or whatever. So it's interesting, but at the minute, I can't talk too much about that.
Understood.
I just wrote a paper, as I said, about a project we did, which was actually based on oil spills. One of the problems encountered on the coast of Texas, on the Gulf Coast there, and in California and other areas, there's problems with this, is where there's natural seeps offshore. And this natural oil mixes with the environment, the sand, sediment, etc., and it gets turned into tar balls, which then wash up in the thousands on beaches. And if you've ever gone to a beach, and you see these black spots on your clothes or on your feet, that's tar. It's oil, basically, that's washed ashore. Well, if we deploy after a spill and try and search a beach, our dogs will be responding on all that tar that's already there. And we don't need to find that. That's not the spill. That's not what we're interested in. That's not what the ecologists or scientists or whoever are interested in cleaning up. They want to clean up the spilled oil. So the question was, well, can you train a dog to ignore oil based on age? So we took the same oil, so the same product, a particular type of crude oil, and we tested, can you train the dog to discriminate between the same product but based on age? And that was the lab-based research which showed you could. And that was I was kind of it's oil, it stinks. And even if it's old, it still stinks. Surely dogs are going to respond on it regardless. No, they very clearly can tell the difference between aged oil and unaged
Wow.
oil. We call it weathered and unweathered. So the results indicated that yes, it can be done. That's a published paper. So then I was tasked with actually training dogs to go in the field. So we did that. We went in the field and it was 100%. Those dogs would totally ignore any of the tar balls on the beach. And every time we went on the beach and did we went monthly to do surveys, there would be tar balls that naturally exist. We didn't have to plant any training aids. We would plant unweathered oil, we'd plant fresh oil in tads along the beach, but we wouldn't plant any of the distractors, the old oil. Not once did a dog ever respond on that old oil. They only ever responded on the fresh stuff. And that just demonstrated how capable these dogs are to discriminate the same product, but just based
Yeah,
on age. And 100% in real life, in the environment, with all those other challenges of working on a beach, it was amazing. So, like I said, I've just written a paper and I submitted it 2 days ago about that project and about how good the dogs were.
that is amazing. That is amazing. And you wouldn't, like you said, you wouldn't think of that they could do that. How do you bridge the gap between controlled research and real world operational demands?
For me, it's experience because I have been fortunate that I have deployed so much and had so many operational finds and, over the years in so many different types of scenarios in situations. I think having that experience in the field allows me to take the information from research and actually apply that to real life and integrate that into deployable assets. So for me, I'm fortunate, but I think it is that it's the experience of doing it for real that allows me to understand all the ins and outs and the difficulties and everything you face as a dog team out there actually doing the job.
Can you share an example of a particular complex, like an interesting odor detection problem you worked on?
The one I just spoke about with the oil was particularly interesting. We did do one which was Bellingers. Bellingers are the eggs of invasive mussels, in our case, an invasive mussel, water mussels. And these are microscopic, like you need an electronic microscope to even see them. And we were asked to actually research, can dogs detect these invasive mussel Bellingers in lake water? Because if you can detect the Bellingers, you can predict a outbreak of these mussels in a water source before they've even developed into the mussels or become a problem, because they're a real problem in America since they've arrived and they've spread all the way from the north of America. Now they're down in Texas and they're spread across to California, and they decimate the lakes and the wildlife, the fish and everything. So there's something that really, needs to be controlled. And we trained the dogs to actually detect these Bellingers in water using the olfactometer device that I spoke about. And the dogs were detecting 5 Bellingers in 10 milliliters of water. I mean, 5 microscopic things that you can only see with an electric microscope. They were detecting at a very high rate and saying, yeah, this contains Bellingers. So I think that was really interesting because, again, you look at that and think, no way, until you actually see it in real life and get the result that, again, just how sensitive dogs are.
That's crazy. That's amazing. What are the biggest challenges in growing these programs globally?
Yeah, again, I go back to convincing other people, convincing scientists that have never worked with dogs, convincing end users that have never worked with dogs. Even in the military and law enforcement, it's the same. If you're not canine, then some people are skeptical. Whether they're skeptical because they don't understand that dogs are so good or can be so good, or in some cases, I've had people worried that dogs are going to take their job away from them. And just convincing people that dogs are there to support. Any search should be what we call in depth. So you have layers of search, and the dog is one of the layers, and then the human and the eyeball is another. And then in the case of explosive detection dogs, you might have metal detectors, mine detectors, tripwire detectors. You have all this other technology behind the dog, but as a team, you hope or you want to find 100% coverage of that location and find everything. And I think that's important for people to understand that the dogs are there. Yeah, in a lot of times they're very much better than a human. But as a team, it's a success. It's not one against the other. So I think, again, it's trying to convince people not in the canine community just how useful dogs are and how they can be integrated to support different projects.
You wrote in print your detection dog in 15 days. What does imprinting mean?
So in our case, in the canine community, what we're talking about is the association between a target odor and, in our case, a reinforcer. And it's that association we're building in the canine that smell, that odor is very important in the dog. Now, I understand in the ecology world, imprinting means a young bird or a young mammal, its connection to its parent. But in the canine world, in Webster's English Dictionary, and I'm not going to quote it exactly because I can't remember exactly, but it's something like it's an experience which is indelibly ingrained into your brain. And that's basically what we're doing with imprinting. We're taking an experience, an odor, and indelibly ingraining that into the canine's brain so that it'll respond on that target odor at all times in the future. So when I talk about imprinting, that's what I'm talking about. That association between the target odor and, in my case, because of the way I train, a reinforcer.
Okay, so with that, how much experience does someone need to be able to do that effectively?
So, with the workbook, and I've had lots of people do it, they can take a pet dog and imprint it on their wallet or their TV remote or something just for fun. And that's fine. It's not a cool process to build an association between a smell and a reinforcer as long as the dog desires a reinforcer of some sort, whether that's food or it's a toy. There's scent clubs and there's competitions that do it all the time with lots of different breeds and lots of different dogs. The difference being in an operational environment where, whether it's conservation or explosive detection or narcotics or whatever it is, landmine detection, we're integrating there a lot of other challenges which are really fundamental in success of that team's deployment, and in some cases they're life-saving. So the complexity of ensuring that canine understands the communication of target odor in all the different contexts that is going to be encountered is very important. So, from just basic training the dog to find your keys or essential oils. But on the other spectrum, looking for a landmine is very different in a naturalized environment that's still fully functioning. There's still a lot of gap between those two skill sets.
If someone is starting from scratch, what's the one principle they absolutely need to understand?
Thorndike's law of effect, and I'll distill that. But basically, and I teach this to everyone, anyone I mentor, anyone I teach in a workshop, Thorndike's law of effect. And in one sentence, what that says is every behavior has a consequence. And in my training lab, it's up on the wall all the time to remind us that. And basically, what Thorndike, he didn't, he discovered it in that he actually put a name to it and actually defined it, is that if there's a if a behavior is followed by something pleasant, it's more likely to be repeated. And if a behavior is followed by something unpleasant, it's less likely to be repeated. Well, every behavior as a consequence tells us that if a dog does something, it's because there's a highly pleasurable experience that it understands is pleasurable. And I think that's part of the understanding that, yeah, you can give a dog a Kong all day, but that doesn't mean that's what the dog finds pleasurable. It might find a car ride pleasurable or a different toy or food more enjoyable than a Kong, and it's that consequence of the behavior that we're trying to establish in training. But also, if a dog does something you don't want it to do, then you have to look at, well, what's the reinforcer? What's it getting out of this? What is the consequence of that behavior in the dog's mind? Otherwise, why would it do that behavior if it wasn't pleasant? So, every behavior has a consequence, I think, is the one sentence that you have to understand as a dog trainer, because that evaluates both training you want to do with the dog, things you want to get that dog to do, but also if the dog does something, you can evaluate why is the dog doing that behavior.
I just learned something new. How important is the handler dog relationship and what ultimately makes a great handler?
To me, I think it's extremely important. if not critical. And I think part of that is that understanding and being able to read your dog and just knowing when, the dog's not well or the dog's not on his game or the dog's acting strange, something's going on, or, that's unusual behavior from my dog, something's not right. And it's that connection, that almost unrecognizable bond that you have with that dog and that ability to interpret that dog's behavior just by the way it's holding its ears or it's looking at you or whatever it is. That's just something that exists in that relationship. And if you're in a high risk role like explosive detection dogs, landmine detection, anything like that, that's obviously critical. But even when we talk about conservation dogs, or environmental detection dogs, for us to be successful in finding an endangered species or an area of contamination or anything, we still have to be able to read our dog's behavior. We still have to understand what it's telling us. And in all those roles, we have to be able to look at our dog and say, my dog's not feeling it today. I better check it out. I better see a vet or do something, because just like us, if your dog's not feeling it and you're trying to make it detect something, there's a good chance that it's got an infection, it's not working properly, and it'll have a miss. And it's not having a miss, it's the fact that you've been amiss in not reading what the dog is telling you. So I think that all comes from that connection and that bond that you have with your dog.
Absolutely. What's one of the hardest scents out there to train for?
Oh, we did a research study and we were using cocaine, and it's impossible for dogs to find cocaine. Cannot do it. We tried. We knew there'd been prior research at Auburn University that said dogs cannot detect cocaine. And we had 99% pure cocaine from a laboratory. And we tried to train the dogs thinking, well, maybe, maybe we can do better. In the olfactory zero, dogs could not detect cocaine. It's methyl benzoate, which is the byproduct of the cutting agents, etc. It's the breakdown of the cocaine to be usable as a drug that actually dogs detect. So we can't expect dogs to be able to detect everything. Sure, everything potentially has an odor, but it doesn't mean dogs can detect that odor. And there's other substances that we know that dogs cannot detect. It's physically impossible for dogs to be able to detect certain odors. So I think some of the biggest challenges for us as we move forward in the world nowadays is we're constantly being asked, can your dog find this? Can your dog find that? Well, until I try it, I can't give you an answer. So the hardest odor that, or the hardest scent to train a dog to find is the next one because I don't know the answer. And then I
Yeah.
have to present a target to a dog and then assess, can you smell this target without frustrating the dog because it can't, or it's difficult, or these different factors. So I have to build tools into that dog, like the all clear, the ability to tell me that there's no target present through a formal response, which is a rewardable behavior. We have to teach the dogs these tools to actually allow us to do this type of research and understand, well, what can dogs detect and what can't they detect?
What's a common myth about detection dogs you'd like to debunk?
Oh, there's lots. I've done a couple of podcasts in the past about myths of detection dogs, and there's lists of them. I hear and I'm like, oh no, that's not right. I guess one of the biggest ones is you can't put obedience on a detection dog. And maybe back in my day, 40 years ago, maybe that was right because the training was compulsion based, and we didn't have tools when I started training. We never used check chains or anything. We didn't have them. It was a leather collar and a rope leash. But
Mm.
certainly compulsion based training for an off leash detection dog can cause problems because you're compulsing the dog to stay with you and saying, out there is not a good place to be. I'm going to make you stay with me. But nowadays, we don't train dogs that way. With positive reinforcement and positive methods, it's actually positive for a dog to be away from us or at our side. They're both positive behaviors. So you can have a really nice, obedient dog. And I'm not talking competitions. None of my dogs would ever win a competition. Absolutely not. But in the field, they have functional obedience to walk on a loose leash, not jump on people, sit when I say, stay when I say, jump on a boat, sit, stay while I get on, not be jumping around, potentially push me off the boat and stuff. So you can have functional obedience and it's not going to affect your detection capability. But there's a long list of types of things that go around that I hear a lot of times that just are not true nowadays. I mean, maybe there's some truth in them from the past, but we've moved on so much nowadays that I don't think most of them stand any credence nowadays in dog training.
If you could train a dog to detect anything in the future, what would it be?
Something no one's ever trained a dog to find, which is what I love as the challenge that I spoke about, because it challenges me as a dog trainer. And I get fortunate over the years of starting Chiron. I've trained dogs to find lots of odors that no one has ever done before. And that's the real challenge because it means I have to develop the training protocols, I have to develop the training plan, I have to analyze how is the odor presented to the dog, how can I communicate to that dog? And then you go out in the field, and the first time the dog has an operational find, no feeling in the world better than that. I don't think. If you've developed a program from scratch, you've trained a dog from scratch, and you've gone out there into the real world, and that dog gives you a train finder response or just change your behavior and says, "Here it is." That I right now, that's giving me goosebumps because I've experienced that so many times that
Oh, wow.
elation of just seeing your dog tell you, "Here it is," after all that work, all those questions, all that investment, and the dog just does it, and that's there's no feeling better. So I think the hardest odor is the next one that no one's ever trained because I invest so much into make sure the dog's prepared and ready to go into the field. But then it also gives you that best experience of when the dog finds it.
So, what excites you the most about the future of detection dogs?
I think the growth of detection dogs now is exponentially more than any other time. It is exponentially more than any other time in human history because people are starting to realize that the utilization of dogs outside of what was law enforcement and military typical roles is now expanding into environmental conservation work,
Uh-huh.
biomedicine type work, agriculture, even within the military and law enforcement, they're expanding with different types of utilization dogs to support those professional fields. Like nowadays, forensic dogs in the police look for body specimens after rape or whatever in houses and can actually identify minute traces in carpet that humans could never find with technology, or certainly not as effective as a dog. So I think the future is just growing. The more and more we understand, the more science is actually able to give us answers, the more that people are starting to use their imagination and actually think, well, maybe a dog will do this, and then trying it out, just moving the whole community forward. And people nowadays coming into the dog world are 40 years ahead of where I was. Everything I've learned up to this point, I can now pass to my training partner and other people on workshops and things, and they were already a head start of where I was. And they're going to be the future that take dog training even further.
So, I think we've come to a kind of a fun part. I kind of enjoy is the rapid fire questions. And of course, you're not on the time or anything, but it's just whatever comes to mind. So, soldier or trainer, which shaped you more?
There's different aspects. A trainer obviously has definitely shaped the person I am nowadays. Obviously, military career
Right.
shapes you as an individual, but the more I've moved on, I've been out as long as I've been in the military, which was 22 years. But working with dogs more and more now, working in the environment, I think now it's being a trainer has shaped the type of person I am nowadays. And whether that's comes with maturity and age and everything else, I
Right.
don't know. But yeah, definitely my integration with the environment and animals and dog training and everything is who I am nowadays.
I got you. Okay. Science or experience?
So one of the sayings I say on my workshops is dog training is the art of science. And I think it's both because science is important and I do obviously get involved in the scientific side and I do read papers and I do integrate it, but at the end of the day it's an art. What we do is we take that science and we mold it into the art of dog training, and dog training will always be an art. You're dealing with a living, breathing, thinking mammal
Right.
that has off days, that has moods, that has feelings, that has desires and drives, etc. So that science can't answer those questions. It's the art of you as a dog trainer that's able to deal with that.
No. Belgian Malinois, German Shepherd, or Labrador Retriever.
Labrador. And I've got two males at the minute, and they're amazing dogs. One of them's
Yep.
phenomenal. I've also had lots of bites on my body, and they're all from German Shepherds and Malinois, because those over-aroused, high-drive dogs that are need controlled, etc., are very different. But I own two Labradors at the minute as well, of my own working dogs. Also have a couple of spaniels. But yeah, I think I'll always lean on the Labrador. I mean, I was raised with Labradors, pointers, border collies. They go back to my childhood, so they will always be ingrained in my life.
One trait you look for immediately in a dog.
Mm. I think as a trait, I suppose sociability you would term it as, but just that connection with a human, because you can get human dogs and you can get dog dogs. That's what I call them. Dog dogs are dogs that actually have no connection with humans. And predominantly, they've been raised in a litter or kennels, not much human interaction. They're socially not connected with people. And if you have a dog, it's very difficult to train them because there's not that connection or that desire to please the human or interact with the human. But with a human dog, there's that connection, that desire to be part of your life, and actually playing with toys, etc., with you is important. So, yeah, I think that's what I would say. The sociability, connection with humans, or that ability to connect with a human.
Most overrated training method.
The ones on social media.
Okay.
Yeah, I look, I post stuff on social media, but I don't do a lot of like show off dog training. It's actual operational work. And my dog,
Right.
I post things where I'm doing operational live searches. My dog gives a response, and it's like, it's not a nose on source, freeze for 3 minutes, perfect train finder response, focus and stuff. It's in the field, and there's the sea's coming in, and it's trying to dance around the waves, but it's trying to keep its tell me where the odor is. That's real life. So people aim for social media type dog training. That's not real life. Real life is messy, and dog training is messy. So I would say most overrated is a lot trying to mimic a lot of this social media type looking dog training when that's not real life.
Right. One mistake that ruins most dogs.
Uh, Rushing the dog, I suppose. Rushing the dog through training
Mm.
and not going at the dog's pace, which is why I like progression plans. They force you to slow down and go at the dog's pace, not the human's ego.
Right. Oh, that's a good one. The stress or distraction, which breaks a canine team more.
Stress, because I believe that if the canine, and I'm assuming we're talking about, well, it's humans as well, if you're unable to deal with stress, then your brain cannot function. And if your brain cannot function because of stress, there's no getting into you. That dog's broken. It's going to fight or flight, and you're going to lose that dog. With distractions, that's a trainable trait. That's a behavior that, in some cases, you've just got to cut your loss and say, this distraction, level of distraction is too dangerous for the job, or will take too much time because I don't have the time. But actually, it is a trainable technique that if you had the time, that you potentially could resolve. With stress, if your dog's going to break down because of stress, there's nothing you can do. It's fight or flight, and you're going to lose that dog's brain. And if the dog's brain can't
Mm.
function, you can't get into that dog. As in, you can't communicate with that dog in any way. So I would say
Okay.
a dog must be able to deal with stress. And it's just like humans. We put soldiers through a lot of stress during basic training to help you
Hmm.
deal with stress. You can learn to deal with stress. You can learn to deal with stressful environments. You have muscle memory. That's why we do weapon handling drills. In a stressful situation, the drill instructor is screaming at you. weapon fires, weapon stops. What do you do? Come on, soldier, what do you do? And they're screaming at you, and you're trying to clear that stoppage in your weapon because in real
Yeah.
life, that's what it's going to be like. That's what you've got
Right.
to deal with. So, and you can do similar things with dogs. Obviously, you have to build the stress correctly, but you can build that stress that dogs deal with stressful lives. But some dogs, if they just break down, they can't cope with that, then forget it.
Right. One belief you've changed your mind on over the years.
Clicker training. So, yeah.
Okay.
A friend of mine, Alec Cool, he was a sergeant major in the veterinary corps, and I was a sergeant at the time. And he said, "Hey, Paul, come round. I've got a video from America I want you to watch." And I went round there. We had a couple of beers, and we're watching clicker training. It's the first time. It was in the mid '90s. It was the first time I'd ever heard of clicker training. And there's a guy there doing click click with treats, and he was teaching agility with a touch stick. That's a stick with a little ball on the end. Taught the dog to put his nose on the ball, and then he moved the ball over the jump or over the catwalk or whatever it was. The dog followed that ball with its nose, so it did the agility, and then he'd click and treat. And I said to Alec, and it's in my book, Imprint Your Detection Dogs, because it was a big change in my life about that. I said, this is a circus trick. I'm a military dog trainer. I'm not going to click, click, and do this sort of stuff. But a couple of years later, I had the Mind Dog program, and clicker training actually solved a problem, a big problem I had in controlling the dogs in searching a path 50 meters long and 1 meter wide that we had to do 100% of. By teaching the dogs that same principle of put your nose on the end of a stick and follow the end of a stick. Well, we used a mine probe with a wine cork on the end. And I taught the dogs to follow the end of the mine probe with their nose. And then we moved that wine cork on the prodder over the path 1 meter wide in a zigzag fashion. So the dog actually went left to right in front of the handler in a zigzag fashion with its nose against the ground, sniffing. In that way, we had complete control over that dog and we searched every inch of that ground for a landmine. And from
Oh,
so from now, every single dog I train is clicker trained. Every dog without fail. And not necessarily because I will use it in the training protocols for that particular dog, but because clicker training, one, it's very positive. It builds a relationship very quick. It's the first thing we do, one of the first things we do. It releases dopamine, so it starts to get the dog wanting to learn. It starts to get the buzz of dopamine and the dog hooked on dopamine, which is what I want. I want the dog to be in that training room bouncing around. I want to learn. I want to learn. I want to get. And after 2 or 3 days, those dogs are
right.
jumping at the door to get into that training room and actually be part of training. I also use it to teach lure, capture, and shape. So we teach those three principles or protocols of dog training during the clicker phase. That allows me to use their techniques at any point during the training process, which includes the imprint phase, because I do use capture, I do use lure, and I do use shaping during those phases. So the dog learns those protocols very early in its training, understands what that protocol is. So I pre-arm the dogs how it's going to learn in my methodology for training dogs. Also with the clicker, I can take the clicker if I'm teaching a new handler and I take out all that anxiety in that new handler of, well, when do I click? Do I get it right? What what am I looking for? I actually click for the handler. So now all you have to do is handle the dog and look at the dog. And when you hear the click, what are you seeing the dog do? Well, that's the behavior we're looking for. And I can actually shape the handler. So nowadays, clicker training is integrated into all my dog training because it has so many advantages outside of just being a fancy circus trick, which I very first thought it was.
So, for our final question, is there anything that we didn't cover that you would like to add or leave the audience with?
Only that, enjoy your dogs, enjoy what you do. Don't take it too seriously. I think, I see dogs out there at times doing their best and people take it too seriously instead of enjoy what you're doing with your dog. If it's a lesson learned, it's a lesson learned and go away and train with what you've learned. And I say dogs don't fail, our training fails. So If a dog does
Right.
something, it's because we haven't communicated clearly what it should be doing, or we haven't prepared it for that situation. Whatever it is, the dog's not doing it maliciously. It's doing it falling back on what we've taught it. So if you're enjoying what you're doing, you're nice and relaxed, and you can learn just as much as your dogs do, then you're going to have a great time. And I love detection. I love training dogs, and I love handling dogs in the field. But I do it because I love it, not because it's stressful, not because it's hard or difficult to actually try and do. I do it because I enjoy it so much. And I think people need to just enjoy their time
Right.
much more with their dogs.
I think it's the best job in the world. You go to work every day with a dog. I love it. Well, Paul, this has been an incredible conversation. The depth of knowledge, the experience, and especially the way that you broke down the science behind the detection work. It really enforces what this show is about. Because at the end of the day, these dogs are more than just tools, they're partners, they're athletes, and they're operating at levels that most people don't fully understand. For those who want to learn more about your work or connect with you, where's the best place for them
So
to
honestly,
go?
the best place right now is I have a school community, that SKOOL, called the Detection Dog Lab. There is a link on it from my website, www.chiron-canine.com. And in that, I give there is classes. There's some of the science classes. There's other classes that I give. It's totally free to join. There's discussion groups. I do a training tip Tuesday. I do a Sunday sermon where I have a bit of a vent about things I see in the community that I think need brought up. I do book reviews, gear reviews. There will be a subscription level starting soon, which is more advanced, and there'll be live calls with myself, questions and answers, advanced classes, those sort of things. But the actual school is free to join. And if people, you can post discussions in the school, and either I and or the community will
Oh,
answer those discussions. So it's very much a learning forum that I'm trying to develop. I've actually closed the Facebook accounts of my business. I found it's too negative on Facebook, and people were not really learning. So I started the school for that reason, that it's a community of dog people. It's all focused on detection. I want to keep it a positive community and one that people can learn from. So that's the best place to connect, and I'm on it every single day.
well, Paul, thanks again for coming on the show. It has been an absolute
Dustin, thank you
pleasure.
for inviting me. I appreciate it very much.
Absolutely. That wraps up our conversation with Paul Bunker. I really hope you enjoyed this episode because there was so much packed into it, from military detection work to science to conservation to the importance of truly understanding the dog in front of you. One thing that stood out to me is Paul's reminder that dogs don't fail, our training fails. That is something every handler and trainer can take something from. Make sure to check out Paul's work with Chiron Canine. And as always, thank you for listening to More Than Just a Canine. Until the next episode, stay safe and God bless.